Hi folks, this is the 11th video in the ongoing adventure of ancestor hunting. We now turn our attention to George Moffat and, by extension, his parents. We found George's birth certificate back in the third video, and this revealed that he was born on the 27th of June 1841 to John Moffat and Isabella Johnston of Borough Street, Carlisle. And the key fact to remember is that his father was a currier. When we look at his marriage certificate to Margaret, which records their marriage in November 1860, we can see that his father is also recorded as John Moffat, a currier. So the first census George would appear in is the one in 1851, but sadly George isn't found in this census living anywhere. But we do find his parents, who are living in Arbroath in Scotland. John is with his wife Isabella, and they are aged 37 and 34 respectively, and have two daughters, Mary, aged 12, so born around 1839 in England, and Hannah, aged 7, born around 1843, also in England, and a one-year-old son John, who was born in Aberdeen, and they're living on Horner's Wynd, and John's occupation is recorded as a courier foreman. Using the information from this census, we can locate the birth certificate of Mary, George's older sister, and we discover that she was born on the 4th of June 1838 to John Moffat and Isabella Johnston in Borough Street, Carlisle, the same street where George was born. John is again a courier. We can also find the birth certificate of Hannah, which records that she was born on the 23rd of October 1843, also in Borough Street in the parish of St Cuthbert's Within in Carlisle. Once again, John is a courier. As to John Moffat, son of John, who was born in Aberdeen in 1850, there were no official registers of births before 1855 in Scotland, so we can't consult them. And as yet I have not found his birth recorded in any online parish register. If we look at the 1861 census, we now find John Moffat, a courier, and his wife Isabella now living in Liverpool Place, Liverpool. This shows that they are living with daughter Hannah, aged 17, so born around 1844 in Carlisle, and John, aged 11, born in Scotland, and two more sons, William, aged 7, so born about 1854 in Scotland, and Joseph, aged 2, born in 1859 in Liverpool. As I've said, Scottish births were not officially registered until 1855, so we are fortunate to find the birth record of William Moffat, which turns out to be a mine of information. This is one of those wow moments. William was born on the 14th of February 1855 at 34 Dunlop Court, Grassmarket, Edinburgh. William was not present when registered. The entry also indicates he was born around noon. His father was John Moffat, a courier, who is 41 years old, so born about 1814 in Carlisle. John Moffat married in 1837 in Carlisle, and William's mother was Isabella Johnston, aged 38, so born about 1817 in Carlisle. And by 1855 they had 2 boys and 4 girls, all of whom were currently living, and 2 girls who had died. And William is their 9th child. 2 of the living girls will be Mary and Hannah, which raises the question of who the other 2 living girls are. The 2 girls who died must have done so before 1855, so this means there are a total of 4 daughters unaccounted for. The 2 boys will be George and John, although, as already noted, George was currently unaccounted for in the 1851 census. A search of various records has not produced any records of other children born to John Moffat and Isabella Johnston between the birth of Mary in 1838 and the birth of William in 1855. But a search of the GRO index reveals that Joseph was born on the 8th of February 1859 in 2 Barnes Court, Livesley Place, Shaw's Court, Liverpool. And John is now a Currier journeyman. A further search of the GRO index reveals the birth of another son, Benjamin Bell, on the 21st of October 1857 at 47 Clayton Street, Liverpool. But sadly he died just 3 weeks later of pneumonia. However, there is a question of where the second name Bell might come from. The marriage of John and Isabella is not recorded in the BMD index, but as the records only began in July 1837, this might suggest that they were married in the first half of the year. However, Isabella may have been under 21 at the time, so technically a minor. So on a hunch, a search of the marriage records of Gretna Green, which after all is only 9 miles north of Carlisle, reveals a John Moffat and Isabella Johnston marrying on the 25th of August 1837. Sadly, there is no information regarding parents, but both were residing in Carlisle, as both the parishes of St Mary's Within and St Cuthbert's are part of that city. Although their son William's birth record records that they were married in 1837 in Carlisle, perhaps there is a stigma, or there was a stigma, attached to the fact that they were really married in Gretna Green. From the 1851 and 1861 censuses, we know that the Currier John Moffat was born around 1814, while his wife Isabella was born around 1816 or 1817, and they were both born in Carlisle. Consequently, searching the 1841 census, we find a Currier John Moffat is living in Castle Street, apparently living with his parents John and Catherine Moffat, aged 55 and 50 respectively, so born around 1786 and 1791. There's a possible twin sister, Mary, as they are both aged 25, and a younger brother aged 15, who is a cabinet maker, and they were all born in the county of Cumberland. Since John and Isabella were married in 1837 and have a daughter Mary, the question is, where are Isabella and Mary? So a search for Isabella Moffat in the 1841 census finds her in Borough Street with her 3-year-old daughter Mary living with George and Maria Johnston. Given that Isabella's maiden name was Johnston, then it is likely that she's staying with her parents, especially as she would be over 7 months pregnant with George. We can also see that Isabella has 2 sisters called Joanna, aged 15, although on the UK Online Census website this has been transcribed as Joshua, and Jemima, aged 14. From these 2 census entries, we can now propose that the parents of John Moffat, the Currier, is John Moffat, a clerk, born in 1786, and Catherine, born 1791, both born in Carlisle, well, in Cumberland anyway. We can also suggest that the parents of Isabella Johnston are George Johnston, a joiner, born around 1791 in Scotland, and Maria, who was also born in 1791 in Scotland. A search of the England Marriages 1538 to 1973 index reveals that a John Moffat married Catherine Slee on the 7th of May 1804 in the parish of St Mary's in Carlisle. However, only a transcript is available on MyHeritage, Ancestry and the Find My Past website. But it does throw up a potential problem. If Catherine was born in 1791, she would have been 13 in 1804, which would be underage for a marriage, especially one that took place in a parish church. John and Catherine Moffat with daughter Mary can be found in the 1851 census, living in 26 Carrick Court, Abbey Street in Carlisle, although the UK Census Online website has Moffat transcribed as Moffat. And John is 62, so born around 1789 and a clerk. Catherine is 59, so born around 1792, while Mary, aged 30, so born around 1821, and she's a hat trimmer. This is a family that are not very good at remembering ages, given that in 1841 John was 50, but 62 in 1851, while Catherine was also 50 in 1841, but 59 10 years later. Meanwhile, Mary was 25 in 1841, but 5 years older 10 years later. Confused? You will be. A search for a John Moffat, clerk in Carlisle, in the 1861 census reveals that he is now in 5 Wood Street at the age of 79, so having aged 17 years in a decade. And he's living with his daughter Mary, a hat trimmer, who is 38, so adding 8 years in the last decade. Meanwhile, John is now a widower, which means we can look for Catherine's death certificate. We find out that Catherine died on the 7th of December 1853, aged 67 years old, which means she was born in 1786, and so was 18 when she married in 1804. Neither John or Mary have yet to be found in the 1871 census, and John has no death registered in the 1860s in Carlisle, so perhaps they moved somewhere else. This is a search that is to be continued. Meanwhile, we can find George and Mary Johnston in the 1851 census, both aged 64, living in Albert Square, Carlisle. But we can only speculate on whether their lives were like a soap opera. We also find Isabella's siblings. There's Hannah, aged 28, Jemima, 25, and then there's George, aged 10, and Mary Ann, aged 8. However, the age gap between Jemima and George would mean that the age of Mary would be around 54 when George was born and 56 when Mary Ann was born, so maybe there is a soap opera plot in there. Were George or Mary Ann really the son and daughter of Hannah/Joanna? A search of the GRO index for a George Johnston born between 1842 and 1844 in Carlisle reveals 4 possibilities, and one of which just has the mother's maiden name, but these results are a little bit inconclusive. Meanwhile, a search of the 1861 census fails to find the Johnston family in Carlisle. However, given that George Johnston was 64 in 1851, and with his absence in the 1861 census, we can speculate that perhaps he died. A search of the BMD index actually reveals that George Johnston did die of bronchitis on the 2nd of December 1852 at the age of 65. However, perhaps the most significant fact is that the informant is George Moffat, who was in attendance. Although there is no age assigned to George Moffat, this could well be his grandson. As we saw in the 1851 census, there is a 10-year-old George Johnston living with George and Mary, so perhaps George Johnston in the census is really George Moffat of the death certificate, which would suggest that rather than being with his parents in Scotland, he stayed in Carlisle with his grandparents. According to the census, Forge Green is in the vicinity of Mill Street and James Street, and although not on the 1868 map, it must have been near the gasworks. So now we have some idea of the early lives of both George and Margaret Moffat. It would be interesting to know how a cotton dyer and a marker-upper met. As to the reasons for their marriage, perhaps a hint can be seen in the fact that John Moffat, their first son, was born 7 months after they were married. We can now update the family tree with much of this new information. We will return to the Moffats in a later video, but in the next video we are going to be looking at the McMurrays again, for as possible relatives they may yet shine more light on Moffat ancestry.